1400 hours on the 4th of April, 2026. The Pentagon Press Briefing Room in Arlington, Virginia. The room was filled with the low, electric hum of television cameras and the rhythmic clicking of professional shutters as the spokesperson for the Department of Defense, a rear admiral in a crisp summer white uniform, stepped to the podium. The air in the room was cool and dry, smelling of floor wax and the faint ozone scent of high-end electronics. Behind the admiral, a massive high-definition screen displayed a map of the Kermanshah province with the specific coordinates of the strike zone highlighted in a neutral blue. The briefing was not a celebration, but a systematic delivery of facts. Regarding the execution of Operation Silent Hammer, the admiral began by confirming that at 5:45 in the morning, local time, a flight of 6 F-35 Lightning, 2 fighters from Carrier Strike Group 9, had conducted a precision strike against the Iranian 81st Armored Division. He emphasized that the operation was a direct response to the unauthorized and aggressive movement of heavy armor toward an international border. The strategic intent of the United States Navy had been to neutralize the threat before it could destabilize the regional security architecture. As he spoke, the screen changed to show a series of black and white satellite images, blurred slightly to protect classified sensor capabilities, showing the before and after of the armored staging area. The technical data provided to the press was staggering in its clarity. The United States confirmed the destruction of 180 T-90S tanks and 80 T-72S tanks, representing over 80% of the division's primary offensive strength. The admiral noted that the use of GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions allowed for the total neutralization of the targets, with zero reported collateral damage to the nearby civilian infrastructure of Kermanshah. He specifically highlighted the surgical nature of the strike, noting that the 2,000-pound warheads were delivered with a circular error probable of less than 5 meters, despite the active electronic interference from Iranian air defense systems. The briefing also addressed the failed Iranian tactical response. The admiral confirmed that multiple S-300 surface-to-air missiles had been launched against the American flight, but all had been successfully defeated by the advanced electronic warfare suites of the F-35 and the supporting EA-18 Gulf Growlers. There were no American casualties, and all 6 aircraft had returned safely to the USS Abraham Lincoln. This statement was met with a flurry of notes from the assembled journalists, as it underscored the total technological overmatch possessed by the United States Navy in a contested environment. The message to the world was clear. The stealth curtain remained impenetrable, and the American ability to project power deep into sovereign territory was absolute. The strategic impact of the strike extended far beyond the twisted metal in the Kermanshah Valley. Diplomatic cables from regional allies expressed a mixture of relief and renewed confidence in American security guarantees. In contrast, the Iranian government's official channels were silent for the first 4 hours following the strike, before issuing a statement that focused on unprovoked aggression without acknowledging the total loss of their armored division. The Department of Defense analysts noted that the strike had not just destroyed tanks, it had destroyed the credibility of the Iranian military's ability to protect its own high-value assets from the air. In the hallway outside the briefing room, senior military advisors huddled over tablets, reviewing the long-term geopolitical ripples. The Silent Hammer had effectively frozen any further Iranian ground movements in the western sector. The logistics of replacing nearly 300 main battle tanks and their trained crews would take years, if not a decade, given the current international sanctions. The operation had achieved a strategic pause in the region, bought with the professional execution of a single carrier-based strike package. The admiral concluded the briefing by stating that the USS Abraham Lincoln would remain on station in the North Arabian Sea, maintaining a posture of modified readiness to respond to any further provocations. As the reporters dispersed, the focus shifted back to the Carrier Strike Group, where the data from the mission was being uploaded to the Indo-Pacific Command and Central Command servers for further study. The mission was being hailed within the halls of the Pentagon as a perfect case study in fifth-generation warfare. The pilots, currently resting in their staterooms aboard the carrier, were being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross for their actions. In the face of heavy anti-aircraft fire, the strategic impact was settled. the message was delivered, and the silent hammer had left a mark that would define the military balance of the Persian Gulf for years to come. 6 in the evening on the 4th of April, 2026. The flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. The carrier was cutting a steady path through the glass-smooth waters of the North Arabian Sea, its massive shadow stretching hundreds of meters across the deep blue surface as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The 6 F-35 Lightning. 2 fighters were now parked securely in the hangar bay below, sheltered from the salt spray and the rising humidity of the evening. The air in the hangar was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the faint, lingering scent of burnt jet fuel, a physical reminder of the morning's deep penetration strike. Maintenance crews in color-coded jerseys moved around the aircraft like a silent army, conducting post-flight inspections and checking every centimeter of the radar-absorbent coating for signs of heat stress or microfractures from the high-G maneuvers over the Zagros Mountains. The final after-action report was being compiled in the Carrier Intelligence Center, a room filled with the soft clicking of keyboards and the low-frequency hum of high-speed data servers. The data was definitive, 100% mission success. A total of 12 2,000-pound GBU 31 Joint Direct Attack munitions had been released, resulting in the confirmed destruction of the primary command nodes and lead armored elements of the Iranian 81st Armored Division. Follow-on damage assessments, verified by multispectral satellite imagery, confirmed that an additional 160 heavy armored vehicles were now nothing more than cooling husks of scrap metal. The division had been downgraded from a frontline offensive spearhead to a non-combat effective force in less than 15 minutes of active engagement. For the United States Navy, the cost was 0 aircraft lost, 0 aircraft damaged, and 0 personnel injured, a perfect execution of modern maritime strike doctrine. Commander Marcus Vance sat in the pilot's ready room, a thick ceramic mug of coffee in his hands. His eyes fixed on a television screen showing a silent loop of the mission's gun camera footage. His flight suit was still damp with sweat beneath his arms, and the deep red marks from his oxygen mask were only just beginning to fade from his cheeks and the bridge of his nose. The room was quiet, the only sound being the steady, rhythmic pulse of the air conditioning. There was no cheering or outward celebration, only the heavy, professional atmosphere of men and women who had performed a difficult, dangerous task with absolute technical precision. Vance knew that the success of the mission was not just his own, but the result of thousands of hours of maintenance, the tireless work of the electronic warfare officers and the growlers, and the precise data provided by the intelligence analysts. The USS Abraham Lincoln and its escort ships had already shifted back to a posture of modified readiness. On the surface, the carrier appeared calm, but beneath the skin, the strike group was as lethal as ever. The sensors of the cruiser CG-73 and the destroyer DDG-51 continued to sweep the horizon and the undersea environment, ensuring the strike group remained protected from any retaliatory submarine or drone attempts. The air wing remained prepared to launch a second wave of FA-18 Super Hornets within 15 minutes if required. But the real-time thermal feeds from the Global Hawk drone showed no signs of Iranian regrouping. The strategic landscape of the region had been fundamentally altered between sunrise and sunset, and the message of American resolve was now etched into the scorched earth of the Kermanshah Valley. The operation, officially recorded as Silent Hammer, would likely be studied at the Naval War College and the Air Force Academy for years to come as a textbook example of high-end, fifth-generation combat. It demonstrated that the combination of stealth, integrated electronic attack, and satellite-guided precision could achieve massive strategic objectives with a speed and efficiency that traditional ground forces could never hope to match. The mission was more than just a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of a technological gap that the adversary had failed to close. As the last light of day disappeared below the horizon, the USS Abraham Lincoln became a dark, low-profile silhouette against the stars, a silent and mobile piece of sovereign American territory ready to project power at a moment's notice. The final electronic summary was transmitted to Indo-Pacific Command and the Joint Chiefs of Staff at exactly 1900 hours. The objective was achieved. The threat was neutralized. The international borders remained secure. The pilots and crews of the Lincoln would sleep tonight knowing they had prevented a larger conflict by winning a single, decisive engagement in the dark. The mission was closed, and the silent hammer was once again ready to fall wherever and whenever the national interest required it. The sea was quiet once more. The only sound the white noise of the wake and the wind whistling through the carrier's radar mast. 2 in the morning. The dark waters of the South China Sea, 12 miles west of Mischief Reef. The nuclear-powered attack submarine, USS North Carolina, drifted at a depth of 60 meters, its hull silent, and its sonar passive. Tonight was not a standard surveillance patrol. It was the start of Operation Coral Shadow, a surgical strike designed to blind the regional sensor network. The water was a heavy, warm weight against the high-tensile steel hull, and the deep ocean currents moved with a slow, rhythmic pull that masked the mechanical heartbeat of the boat. Inside the lockout chamber, the air smelled of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic scent of wet diving gear. In the cramped, flooded compartment of the submarine, 8 members of SEAL Team 6 prepared for transition. They were divided into 2 4-man elements, designated red and blue, each assigned to an SDV Mark 11 SEAL delivery vehicle. These submersibles were the silent chariots of the underwater world, powered by quiet electric motors and capable of navigating through the most heavily monitored waters on Earth. The divers checked their rebreathers, ensuring no bubbles would betray their position as they moved toward the reef. At exactly 2:15 in the morning, the outer hatch of the USS North Carolina cycled open. The first SDV Mark 11 pushed out into the void, its small propeller spinning at a low frequency to minimize acoustic signatures. The second craft followed 4 minutes later, maintaining a distance of 50 meters to avoid any chance of a collision in the murky, silt-filled water. The teams were operating at coordinates 9 degrees 55 minutes north, 115 degrees 32 minutes east, moving toward the western gap of the Mischief Reef Lagoon. The mission parameters were strict, and the timeline was compressed. The SEALs had exactly 3 hours to reach the target, set their charges, and exfiltrate before the morning sun revealed the silhouettes of their specialized craft. The SDV Mark 11 pilots used high-frequency, low-probability of intercept sonar to map the jagged coral formations ahead. Every meter of the seafloor was a potential hazard, from discarded fishing nets to the sharp, rising fingers of the reef that could puncture the composite hull of the delivery vehicles. As they approached the 3-mile limit from the reef, the water temperature rose slightly, a result of the shallow lagoon spilling its sun-warmed contents into the deep sea. The divers felt the change through their thin wetsuits, a sensory reminder that they were leaving the safety of the abyss for the lethal environment of the adversary's front door. Above them, the surface was a chaotic mix of white foam and dark swells, but at a depth of 10 meters, the SEALs moved through a world of eerie, muted blue. The Chinese military had turned Mischief Reef into a fortress equipped with AN/SPY-6 equivalent phased array radars and high-definition thermal cameras mounted on towering concrete pylons. To bypass these, the SEALs stayed close to the seafloor, utilizing the natural clutter of the reef to hide their approach. The pilots adjusted the trim of the SDV Mark 11, hugging the contours of the coral at a speed of 5 knots. The hum of the electric motors was almost undetectable, lost in the natural cacophony of the ocean's snapping shrimp and shifting sands. By 2:55 in the morning, the 2 teams reached the mouth of the lagoon. This was the most dangerous phase of the infiltration. The gap was narrow, guarded by underwater hydrophones, and guarded on the surface by a rotating patrol of small, fast attack boats. The SEALs slowed their pace to 3 knots, drifting with the incoming tide to reduce their wake. The pilots monitored their heads-up displays, watching for the telltale signature of an active sonar ping from the Chinese garrison. Through the green-tinted lenses of their night vision goggles, the SEALs could see the massive concrete structures of the military installation rising out of the water like the bones of a prehistoric beast. The airfield lights were dimmed, but the red glow of obstruction markers blinked rhythmically against the black sky. The teams knew that hundreds of personnel were stationed just a few hundred meters away, sleeping in reinforced barracks, unaware that the United States Navy had already breached their perimeter. The SDV Mark 11 craft settled into a deep crevice in the coral at the edge of the lagoon's inner basin. The SEALs disconnected from the vehicle's onboard air supply and switched to their independent rebreathers. One by one, they exited the submersibles, tethering the craft to the reef to ensure they would be there for the return journey. The divers moved with practiced, liquid grace, their fins cutting through the water without a sound. The infiltration was complete. The teams were now inside the lagoon, positioned within sight of the main pier and the towering radar hub that dominated the southern end of the reef. The air above the water was thick with the smell of diesel and salt, but below the surface, the SEALs were ghosts in the machinery of war. They checked their waterproof watches. 3:15 in the morning. The clock was ticking toward the first detonation. 3:20 in the morning. The southern arc of Mischief Reef. The 8 men of red and blue elements transitioned from the buoyancy of the lagoon to the crushing weight of their combat gear as they reached the shore. Each SEAL carried approximately 65 pounds of equipment, including specialized explosives, suppressed Mk-18 Mod 1 carbines, and multispectral communication arrays. The transition from water to land was the moment of maximum vulnerability. The sand here was not natural. It was a coarse, bleached white aggregate dredged from the seafloor, and it crunched with a distinct metallic sound under the weight of their combat boots. The team leaders, designated Red 1 and Blue 1, paused at the high water mark, their GPN-VG-18 panoramic night vision goggles scanning the horizon. To the human eye, the reef was a void of shadow and flickering red markers, but through the phosphor lenses, the world was a neon green landscape of tactical data. 200 meters to the east, a 20-meter surveillance tower loomed. Over the beach, its gimbaled thermal camera sweeping back and forth in a slow, mechanical arc. The SEALs waited for the camera to hit its limit of travel before signaling the advance. They moved in a staggered file, keeping low to the ground to minimize their silhouettes against the pale sand. The air was thick with the scent of tropical decay, salt spray, and the faint, oily tang of the dredging equipment used to build this artificial island. The temperature remained a humid 30 degrees, and sweat began to sting their eyes beneath their goggles, but no one reached up to wipe it away. Discipline was absolute. Every movement was calculated to sync with the ambient noise of the waves hitting the concrete tetrapods that lined the shore. Blue team split off toward a cluster of shipping containers that served as a makeshift storage area for the airfield's maintenance crews. Their objective was to find a position that offered a clear line of sight to the main pier and the Type 056, a corvette docked there. Meanwhile, Red team moved toward the southern radar hub, a hardened concrete structure topped with a massive radome. This facility was the brain of the reef's defense network, linked by 2 fiber optic cables to the surface-to-air missile batteries scattered across the island. As Red team approached the perimeter fence of the radar hub, they encountered the first layer of the adversary's automated defense, a ground-based vibration sensor network. Red 3, the team's lead scout, knelt in the sand and pulled a handheld electronic warfare device from his vest. The device, an AN/PRC-161, emitted a localized jamming signal that created a dead zone in the sensor's mesh network. For a window of exactly 90 seconds, the ground beneath them would register as empty space. The SEALs moved through the gap in the sensors with a rhythmic, rolling gait designed to mimic the movement of wind-blown debris. They reached the shadow of the radar hub's exterior wall at 3:45 in the morning. The concrete was warm to the touch, radiating the heat it had absorbed during the concrete. Long tropical day. High above, the low hum of the radar's cooling fans provided a steady acoustic mask for their whispers. Red 1 to Blue 1, "We're at the base of the primary objective," the team leader whispered into his bone conduction headset. "Initiating observation post. Report status. Blue 1 is in. Position behind the maintenance sheds." The reply came clear and cold. "We have eyes on the pier. The garrison is quiet. One sentry on the corvette's deck, currently looking north toward the airfield. No signs of alerted activity." Red team began the process of establishing a hidden observation post. Netting system. designed to defeat both visual and thermal detection. Within 10 minutes, the 4 men were effectively invisible, tucked into a narrow crawl space beneath the radar hub's external venting system. From this vantage point, they could see the entire southern half of the installation, including the power generation plant and the Pardon Barracks, where the majority of the Chinese garrison was currently asleep. The team's primary sniper, Red 4, deployed a long-range laser designator. He began painting the critical structural points of the radar hub, not for a missile strike, but to calculate the exact placement of the demolition charges they would set in. The next phase. The mission was not just to damage the facility, but to ensure its complete structural failure. Every bolt, every weld, and every reinforced pillar was logged into their digital tactical map. The silence of the reef was deceptive. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of a heavy generator started up, sending a slight tremor through the ground. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness near the airfield as a security jeep began its scheduled patrol. The SEALs froze, their bodies melding into the shadows of the concrete. They watched the jeep pass, its yellow beams illuminating the rows of J-11 fighter jets parked on the tarmac 300 meters away. The clock hit 4 in the morning. The reconnaissance phase was complete. The teams had successfully bypassed the multi-million-dollar sensor suite and established a foothold in the heart of the fortress. Now, the mission would shift from observation to direct action. The SEALs began to prime their explosive kits. The soft clicks of the detonators, the only sound in the humid night air. 4:15 in the morning. The deep shadows beneath the main pier of Mischief Reef. Blue Team's 2 combat divers, designated Blue 3 and Blue 4, drifted through the stagnant water toward the massive hull of the Type 056A corvette. The harbor water was warm and carried the heavy, oily scent of diesel exhaust and the chemical bite of industrial solvents from the nearby maintenance shops. Above them, the pier was a forest of reinforced concrete pilings, each one thick with barnacles and slick with the algae of the South China Sea. The divers moved with liquid precision, their Mk-25 dragger rebreathers, ensuring that not a single bubble broke the surface to betray their presence to the sentries pacing the decks above. The corvette, a 1,000-ton hunter-killer, sat low in the water, its generators humming with a low-frequency vibration that the SEALs felt in their teeth. This vessel was the primary mobile threat to their exfiltration. If it remained operational, its automatic cannons and searchlights could shred their delivery vehicles before they reached the safety of the open ocean. Blue 3 reached out and touched the cold steel of the ship's hull, feeling the rhythmic pulse of the machinery within. He signaled to his partner. Using a series of tactile hand squeezes, a silent language developed for the absolute darkness of underwater sabotage, they began the process of attaching 8 Mark 186 magnetic induction charges along the ship's keel. These were not standard explosives. They were shaped charges designed to focus the blast upward, punching a series of jagged holes through the double-bottom hull. Each charge weighed 15 pounds and was packed with a high-density plastic explosive that remained stable even under extreme pressure. Blue 4 carefully placed a charge every 5 meters, focusing on the areas directly beneath the engine room and the primary ammunition magazine. The magnetic grips clicked onto the steel with a soft, dull thud that was masked by the ambient noise of the harbor. The divers then transitioned their focus to the pier itself. The structure was the lifeline of the reef, providing the only deep-water berth for resupply ships and reinforcements. Blue 3 pulled a thermal cutting charge from his leg holster, a specialized device intended to sever the thick steel rebar inside the concrete pilings. By weakening the structural supports at key stress points, the SEALs intended to cause a progressive collapse of the pier once the explosives were triggered. They worked in the dark, guided only by the tactile memory of their training and the dim, green glow of their dive computers. At 4:35 in the morning, the divers reached the main fuel manifold, where a series of thick pipes carried aviation, kerosene, and marine diesel from the storage tanks to the docking berths. This was a high-value secondary target. Blue 4 attached a specialized incendiary device to the primary valve assembly. This device was timed to ignite seconds after the initial blast turning the spilled fuel into a localized inferno that would prevent the garrison from fighting the fires on the ship or the pier. The smell of the sea here was replaced by the cloying, sweet aroma of unrefined oil leaking from a loose coupling. The tension in the water was palpable. Every time a sentry's heavy boots thudded on the wooden planks of the pier above. The seals froze, pressing themselves against the cold concrete pilings. They were less than 10 meters away from the enemy, separated only by a thin layer of water and the arrogance of a garrison that believed its fortress was impenetrable. The divers checked their oxygen levels. They were at 60% capacity, more than enough to complete the sabotage and return to the rendezvous point. Blue 1, this is Blue 3. The diver whispered into his underwater comms unit, the signal vibrating through the water to the relay station established by the team on the beach. Copy. Blue 3. The response came back. A burst of static-filled audio. Red team is moving on the radar hub now. Watch for increased security near the generator blocks. Thermal sensors are active in that sector. The two SEALs began their slow swim away from the pier, moving deeper into the lagoon toward the island's industrial heart. The water remained dark, but the first faint hints of pre-dawn light began to filter down from the surface, turning the world into a hazy, charcoal gray landscape. They navigated by compass, maintaining a heading of 090 degrees. Every stroke of their fins was a calculated risk, a gamble against the high-definition sonar arrays that guarded the inner basin. Behind them, the Type 056, a corvette, remained silent. A tomb of steel, waiting for the clock to run out. The explosives were primed, their digital displays counting down the seconds in a steady, silent rhythm. The SEALs had turned the harbor into a trap, and the teeth were about to snap shut. As they cleared the pier's shadow, Blue 3 looked back one last time, seeing only the dark, unmoving shape of the ship against the starlit sky. The mission was moving from infiltration to destruction, and the cost of discovery was now total. 4:50 in the morning. The concrete base of the southern radar hub on Mischief Reef, Red Team, led by Red 1, began their vertical ascent of the primary sensor tower. The air at this height was slightly cooler, stripped of the lagoon's humidity, by a steady 10-knot breeze coming off the open ocean, but it carried the sharp ozone smell of high-voltage electronics and the persistent thrum of cooling fans. The tower, a reinforced pillar of steel and masonry, stood 40 meters above the reclaimed land, acting as the primary eyes and ears for the Chinese surface-to-air missile batteries. To blind the reef, this structure had to do more than just stop working. It had to be physically decapitated. The four SEALs moved up the external maintenance ladder in a staggered formation, their boots making no sound, on the rubber-coated rungs. Each man utilized a blackened carabiner to tether himself to the rail, a safety precaution against the buffeting wind. They were now well above the primary light spill of the garrison's street lamps, moving through a zone of absolute shadow, created by the massive curve of the radome above them. Red 3, the lead climber, paused every 10 meters to scan the catwalks above with his thermal optics, looking for the heat signature of a roving guard or an automated internal sensor. At the 30-meter mark, they encountered the first security gate. It was a heavy steel mesh door locked with a digital keypad and monitored by a fixed-angle camera. Red 1 did not use a bypass tool. Instead, he signaled Red 2, who carried a specialized hydraulic silent cut tool. The device, powered by a compact electric motor, bit into the steel hinges with a muffled groan. Within 20 seconds, the door was eased open and secured with a bungee cord to prevent it from banging in the wind. They were inside the inner sanctum of the sensor array. As they stepped onto the primary catwalk, a single Chinese sentry emerged from the pressurized equipment room, carrying a Type 95 bullpup rifle slung over his shoulder. He was lighting a cigarette, the orange glow of the cherry momentarily blooming in the darkness. He never saw the four shadows merging with the steel bulkheads. Red 1 raised his Mk-18 Mod 1 carbine, the thick cylinder of the suppressor leveled at the center of the man's chest. Two soft coughs of expanding gas followed. The sound of the bolt cycling was louder than the shots themselves. The sentry collapsed without a cry, his body caught by Red 3 before it could hit the metal grating. They dragged the man into the shadows, the smell of acrid tobacco smoke still hanging in the air. With the perimeter breached, the team moved into the high-frequency transmitter room. The interior was a labyrinth of server racks, glowing blue LED lights, and thick bundles of fiber optic cables that pulsed with the data of 1,000 radar returns. The temperature inside was a constant 20 degrees, maintained by a massive industrial chiller. Red 2 and Red 4 began the brain surgery of the mission. They ignored the servers and went straight for the primary waveguide assemblies, the massive copper tubes that funneled microwave energy to the antenna array. They placed 4-pound blocks of C4 plastic explosive at the base of each waveguide, wrapping them in silver det cord. These charges were designed not for a massive fireball, but for high-velocity cutting power. When detonated, they would sever the connections between the radar's processing core and the antenna, rendering the entire multi-million-dollar system a useless hunk of glass and steel. Red 4 worked with the precision of a watchmaker, threading the blasting caps into the explosive blocks, while Red 1 maintained security at the door, his eyes fixed on the stairwell leading down to the garrison barracks. Red 1 to Blue 1. The team leader whispered into his bone conduction mic. The brain is wired. We are placing the secondary charges on the structural supports now. Status of the airfield? Blue 1 is moving toward the hangars. The reply came through the encrypted channel. We've bypassed the southern perimeter. The J-11 fighters are fueled and ready on the tarmac. We are prepping the thermite for the intake fans. 5 minutes until we reach the primary hangar block. Red Team exited the transmitter room and began descending the tower's interior spine. As they moved, they placed clacker charges on every third structural pillar. These were smaller, shaped charges intended to buckle the tower's frame, ensuring that the weight of the 10-ton radome would cause the entire structure to tilt and eventually collapse into the sea. The complexity of the demolition was a testament to the professionalism of the team. They weren't just blowing things up, they were engineering a catastrophe. By 5:15 in the morning, Red Team reached the base of the tower. They disappeared back into the bleached white sand of the beach, merging with the shadows of the concrete tetrapods. The mission was now entering its most volatile phase. The explosives were set, the sentries were neutralized, and the clock was winding down to the coordinated strike. The air was deathly still, the only sound the distant, rhythmic wash of the waves against the reef. In 15 minutes, that silence would be shattered forever. 5:28 in the morning. The southern edge of the Mischief Reef airfield. The pre-dawn light was a thin, bruised purple on the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the reclaimed land. The air was heavy, pregnant with the scent of salt and the ozone of the cooling electronics from the nearby radar hub. In 2 minutes, the meticulously placed explosives across the island would detonate. In a synchronized sequence designed to paralyze the garrison, Red and Blue teams had converged near the primary command and control center, a 2-story reinforced concrete blockhouse that served as the nerve center for all military operations on the reef. The SEALs had transitioned from the role of silent saboteurs to a dedicated assault force. They took up positions behind a line of concrete HESCO bastions, their Mk-18 Mod 1 carbines leveled at the entrance of the blockhouse. The digital timers on their wrist-mounted displays flickered through the final 10 seconds. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, the harbor erupted. A series of deep, rhythmic thuds vibrated through the ground as the magnetic charges on the Type 056, a corvette, detonated. The ship's hull split open, and a secondary explosion from the aft ammunition locker sent a pillar of white-hot flame 80 meters into the air. The trigger was squeezed on a shoulder-fired M3 multi-role anti-armor, anti-tank weapon system. The high-explosive dual-purpose round shrieked off the launcher with a deafening roar, a backblast of sand and heat washing over the SEAL's position as the projectile streaked across the 70-meter gap toward the command and control center. The rocket motor burned a bright, magnesium-white trail through the dim light, its scream echoing off the hardened aircraft hangars. The smell of burning propellant filled the air, instantly, sharp and chemical. The warhead punched straight through the reinforced steel door of the command center, detonating inside the narrow entry vestibule. The blast wave was contained by the concrete walls, magnifying the pressure until the forward windows shattered outward in a rain of jagged glass and pulverized masonry. A fireball bleached the sky white for a fraction of a second as the internal fuel supply for the building's backup generator ignited. 6 tons of concrete debris and twisted metal were sent flying across the tarmac, and the primary communications mast atop the building buckled, its steel lattice snapping like dry wood before it collapsed into the inferno. The defending soldiers inside the barracks nearby scrambled into the open, many still clutching their Type 95 rifles, while struggling to don their body armor. They were met by a wall of disciplined, suppressed fire from the SEAL fire teams. The Chinese garrison attempted to form a skirmish line near the smoking ruins of the command center, but the chaos of the dual explosions at the pier and the radar hub had shattered their chain of command. 3 soldiers were cut down as they tried to reach a mounted heavy machine gun position, their bodies thrown backward by the kinetic impact of the 5.56mm rounds. In the confusion, a group of 4 defenders broke cover and ran toward the airfield, only to be suppressed by a precision-timed grenade from Red 3. Black smoke choked the corridor between the burning command center and the first hangar block, reducing visibility to less than 5 meters. The air was filled with the screech of tearing metal and the frantic, overlapping shouts of the garrison trying to coordinate a defense through the static-filled radio channels. The primary radar tower, its structural supports severed by Red Team's earlier work, began a slow, agonizing tilt toward the lagoon. It groaned as the steel groaned under the tension, finally snapping with a sound like a thunderclap before the entire 10-ton radome plunged into the water, sending a massive spray of silt and salt into the air. The SEALs did not wait for the smoke to clear. Red 1 signaled the advance, and the 2 fire teams moved in, a leapfrog formation toward the northern airfield. Their objective was now the destruction of the J-11 fighter jets before the remaining pilots could reach the cockpits. The garrison's initial shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a desperate, disorganized resistance. Small arms fire began to peck at the Hesco bastions where the SEALs had been seconds before, but the Americans were already 50 meters down the tarmac, moving with the terrifying speed of a practiced machine. The primary objective, destruction of the reef's ability to coordinate and see, had been achieved in less than 60 seconds. The brain of this island was a burning shell, and the eyes were at the bottom of the lagoon. The mission had reached its highest point of violence, and the cost was visible in the mounting casualties of the defending force. 12 Chinese personnel were confirmed, neutralized in the initial breach, with an estimated 20 more trapped inside the burning structures. The SEALs remained unscathed, their movements fluid and their communication minimal. 5:35 in the morning. The northern end of the Mischief Reef airfield. The smoke from the burning command and control center drifted across the 2,000-meter runway in thick, oily ribbons, partially obscuring the pre-dawn light. The air smelled of burnt insulation, salt, and the sweet, cloying aroma of JP-5 aviation fuel leaking from severed supply lines. Blue Team, now operating as the primary demolition element for the airfield, moved toward the first of 3 hardened aircraft hangars. These structures were massive arched shells of reinforced concrete designed to protect the garrison's most valuable aerial assets from both the elements and incoming fire. Inside, the silhouettes of 12 J-11 fighter jets were visible, their sleek, twin-engine frames reflecting the flickering orange light of the fires burning to the south. The SEALs maintained a perimeter of 50 meters around the first hangar entrance, while 2 members of Blue Team moved inside to begin the sabotage. The interior of the hangar was a cavernous space filled with the rhythmic hum of industrial air scrubbers and the sharp, metallic tang of hydraulic fluid. The J-11 fighters, modeled after the Russian Su-27, were parked in neat rows, their cockpits open as if waiting for pilots who would never arrive. Blue 3 pulled a specialized magnetic thermite grenade from his chest rig, placing it directly over the engine intake of the lead aircraft. This device was designed to burn at temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees, melting the titanium turbine blades into a useless slag of molten metal within seconds. The destruction was systematic and calculated. The SEALs did not intend to level the hangars, which would require more explosives than they could carry, but rather to ensure that not a single aircraft could ever take flight again. They placed 6 pounds of C4 plastic explosive on the main landing gear of each jet, focusing on the hydraulic actuators and the delicate sensor arrays in the nose cones. In total, the team deployed 42 magnetic charges across the 12 fighter jets and 2 Yacht transport aircraft parked in the adjacent maintenance bay. The work was performed in near-total silence, the only sound, the soft click of the magnetic mounts against the airframes, and the distant, muffled pops of small arms fire from the garrison's disorganized pockets of resistance. As they reached the final hangar, a squad of airfield security personnel emerged from a sandbagged bunker near the fuel farm. These soldiers were equipped with Type 95 rifles and were supported by a single QJZ-89 heavy machine gun mounted on a light utility vehicle. The Chinese security team fired a series of green star clusters into the air to illuminate the tarmac, the emerald light casting long, dancing shadows across the concrete. Blue 1 signaled for the team to take cover behind a row of mobile power units. The heavy machine gun opened fire, its 12.7mm rounds punching through the thin metal skin of the power units with a rhythmic, metallic clanging that echoed across the airfield. Red Team, positioned on a small rise 200 meters to the west, provided immediate suppression. Red 4, the team sniper, utilized his Mk-13 Mod 7 sniper rifle to engage the machine gunner. From his elevated position, he could see the heat signature of the gunner's head and shoulders through his thermal optic. He squeezed the trigger once, the suppressed rifle emitting a dull thump. The machine gunner was thrown backward off the vehicle, and the heavy weapon fell silent. The remaining security personnel scrambled for cover behind a stack of fuel drums, but they were pinned down by the combined fire of the 2 SEAL elements. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. The SEALs utilized a pair of M32 AON multiple grenade launchers to fire a spread of 40mm high-explosive rounds into the security bunker. The explosions erupted in a rapid-fire sequence, the blast waves shattering the sandbags and sending debris flying into the air. With the immediate threat neutralized, Blue Team finished wiring the final set of charges on the Yacht transport planes. The air was now thick with the smell of cordite and the acrid smoke of the burning utility vehicle. At 5:45 in the morning, Blue 1 triggered the first phase of the airfield demolition. A series of white-hot flashes illuminated the interior of the hangars as the thermite grenades ignited simultaneously. The sound was not a bang, but a terrifying, high-pitched hiss as the metal of the jet engines was consumed by the chemical fire. Seconds later, the C4 charges on the landing gear detonated. In a synchronized wave of low-frequency thuds, the 12 J-11 fighters collapsed onto the hangar floor, their airframes buckling as the support struts were severed. The 2 transport planes were gutted by internal fires that quickly spread to the nearby fuel bladders. The airfield was now a graveyard of blackened, twisted aluminum. The Chinese military had lost its primary means of projecting air power from Mischief Reef in a single 20-minute window. The SEALs began their withdrawal toward the rendezvous point on the northern beach, moving with the same disciplined urgency that had defined the mission from the start. Behind them, the hangars were filled with the roaring sound of uncontrolled fires, and the black smoke rose in a towering column that could be seen for 20 miles. The mission was 80% complete, but the most difficult phase, the exfiltration under fire, was about to begin. 5:50 in the morning. The northern perimeter of the Mischief Reef airfield. The first of 3 ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicles roared out from the southern motor pool, its high-output diesel engine screaming as it chewed through the reclaimed sand and gravel. The SEALs were less than 400 meters from the primary extraction beach when the heavy rumble of tracks and the smell of thick, black exhaust reached them. The armored vehicles represented a significant escalation in the garrison's response, moving at 50 kilometers per hour to cut off the teams before they could reach the lagoon. The pre-dawn air was now a cocktail of salt spray, burning rubber, and the acrid, metallic stink of destroyed armor. Red and blue elements immediately shifted into a defensive-bounding overwatch, utilizing the concrete debris of a destroyed weather station for cover. The two fire teams were separated by 30 meters, providing overlapping fields of fire across the open coastal plain. Red 1 identified the lead infantry fighting vehicle as the primary threat, as its 30mm automatic cannon began to rake the SEAL's position with high-explosive incendiary rounds. The shells impacted the concrete with a rhythmic, bone-jarring thud, sending shards of stone and hot metal humming through the air. The SEALs responded with the surgical precision of a heavy weapons platoon. Red 2 knelt in the sand, bracing the FGM-148 Javelin launch tube against his shoulder. He waited for the thermal seeker to lock onto the intense heat signature of the leading armored vehicle's engine block. The seeker head emitted a steady, high-pitched tone in his headset, confirming a solid track. The trigger was squeezed. The missile shrieked off the rail, a white column of fire punching backward through the humid air as the soft launch system kicked the round clear of the shooter. The heat blast washed across the faces of the sailors standing nearest, and the smell of burning propellant filled their lungs. The Javelin climbed high into the gray sky, following its programmed top attack profile before diving vertically toward the thin roof armor of the target. The warhead punched clean through the turret ring, detonating the 30mm ammunition stored inside the hull. The turret lifted straight off the chassis, 6 tons of steel rising 4 meters into the air before it fell back and crushed 2 soldiers who had been running alongside the vehicle for cover. The hull itself split along the weld seams, and a massive secondary explosion from the fuel cells sent a fireball 40 meters into the sky, bleaching the gray horizon white for 3 full seconds. Black smoke boiled out of every opening, carrying the stench of scorched paint and vaporized oil. The second infantry fighting vehicle swerved violently to avoid the flaming wreckage of its leader, its driver banking hard toward a shallow drainage ditch. The remaining Chinese infantry tumbled out of the rear hatches into the sand, coughing and blinded by the thick, oily smoke that now choked the northern perimeter. They attempted to set up a base of fire with a Type 88 general-purpose machine gun, but the weapon was silenced within seconds by a concentrated burst of fire from Blue Team. The SEALs utilized their suppressed Mk-18 carbines to pick off the disoriented defenders, ensuring that no organized counterattack could form. Despite the loss of their lead vehicle, the 3rd Z-BD-04A continued its advance, firing its coaxial machine gun in long, desperate bursts. The rounds kicked up plumes of white sand just inches from Blue 1's position. Blue 4 moved to the flank, deploying an M722 light anti-armor weapon. He waited for the vehicle to expose its side profile. As it navigated around a cluster of fuel drums, the rocket ignited with a sharp, metallic crack, the projectile striking the drive sprocket of the vehicle. The track snapped instantly, and the armored carrier ground to a halt, spinning in a useless circle as its engine roared in protest. The engagement had lasted less than 4 minutes, but the cost to the garrison was severe. 2 multi-million-dollar infantry fighting vehicles were burning wrecks, and an estimated 16 enemy personnel had been neutralized in the exchange. The SEALs had expended 2 Javelin missiles and 1 light anti-armor rocket, but they had maintained their momentum. Red 1 checked his watch, 5:58 in the morning. The first sliver of the sun was breaking over the horizon, and the window for a stealthy extraction was closing rapidly. The air was filled with the overlapping shouts of the garrison and the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens from the northern barracks. The SEALs did not linger to admire their work. They moved in a low, fast crouch toward the waterline, their eyes scanning the lagoon for the silhouettes of their extraction craft. The counterattack had been broken, but the entire island was now awake and screaming for blood. The teams reached the high water mark, the sand beneath their boots wet with the incoming tide. 6:10 in the morning. 12 miles west of Mischief Reef, the destroyer USS Mason, DDG-87, was already at maximum readiness, her bow slicing through the 4-foot swells of the South China Sea at a speed of 30 knots. This was not a routine, freedom of navigation transit. The ship was operating as the primary fire support platform for the extraction of the SEAL teams. On the fore bridge, the dim red tactical lighting was replaced by the pale, cold glow of the pre-dawn sun reflecting off the bridge windows. The air inside the skin of the ship was cool and dry, a sharp contrast to the humid, salt-laden gale screaming past the antenna arrays on the mast. The commanding officer of the USS Mason stood at the central console, his eyes fixed on the digital blue force tracker. The icons for red and blue teams were flashing amber on the northern shoreline of the reef, indicating they were under heavy pressure. "Guns. Bridge," the captain said. "Into the internal circuit. Target the northern coastal battery at coordinates 9 degrees 55 minutes north, 115 degrees 33 minutes east. We need a suppression corridor for the site. Extraction craft. 5 rounds, fire for effect." Below the bridge, on the forward deck, the Mark 45, Mod 4 5-inch naval gun began its lethal choreography. The 62 caliber barrel, finished in a non-reflective sea gray, swung toward the horizon with a high-pitched hydraulic whine. The automated loading system in the magazine below cycled a 70-pound high-explosive projectile into the breech. The smell of cold grease and hydraulic fluid permeated the gun turret, and the deck beneath the mount shuddered as the massive steel gears locked the weapon onto its firing solution. The trigger was squeezed in the Combat Information Center. The 5-inch gun roared, a massive horizontal column of orange flame and white smoke punching outward from the muzzle. The shockwave of the first shot flattened the sea spray around the bow, and the sharp, metallic crack of the supersonic projectile leaving the barrel echoed across the water for miles. The heat from the blast was so intense it shimmered the air above the deck for several seconds, and the acrid, sulfurous stink of burnt powder drifted back toward the bridge. The projectile traveled at a speed of 820 meters per second, arcing over the horizon in a high, ballistic curve. Seconds later, the round struck the reinforced concrete bunker of the northern coastal battery. The warhead punched straight through the 3-foot-thick blast wall before detonating inside the ammunition handling room. The impact was catastrophic. A fireball bleached the morning sky white, followed by a secondary explosion that sent the battery's twin-barrel tracked gun system flying 50 meters into the lagoon. The entire northern tip of the reef erupted in a spray of pulverized concrete and burning debris, and the black smoke rose in a thick, vertical pillar that blotted out the rising sun. The defending garrison on the beach, which had been preparing to suppress the SEAL's extraction point, was thrown into a state of absolute panic. The blast wave from the 5-inch shell had compressed the chests of every soldier within a 100-meter radius, throwing men off their feet and shattering the glass in the remaining security towers. The sound of metal tearing and the roar of the fire inside the battery replaced the chatter of small arms. Fire. For exactly 5 seconds, there was a dead silence on the Chinese radio nets, followed by a chaotic eruption of voices screaming for medical assistance and air cover that would never arrive. The USS Mason did not stop at one round. The gun mount cycled again and again, firing a total of 15 rounds in a rhythmic, terrifying cadence. Each shot sent a new tremor through the ship's hull, and the deck was soon littered with the massive, steaming brass casings ejected from the breach. The suppression corridor was established. A wall of fire and steel now separated the SEAL teams from the remnants of the Chinese garrison, creating a 300-meter zone where nothing could survive. The air above the lagoon was now a swirling vortex of gray ash and black smoke. The SEALs, watching the naval gunfire impact from their position at the waterline, saw the horizon light up with the consecutive flashes of the Mark 45 rounds. The heat from the distant explosions reached them as a warm, dry gust of wind that carried the smell of ozone and pulverized stone. Red 1 signaled for the teams to begin the final push to the water. The path was clear, carved out by the precision of the water, United States Navy's long-range reach. As the smoke from the final naval shell began to settle, The sound of the ocean returned the rhythmic wash of the waves against the shore, now competing with the crackle of burning wreckage. The northern battery was a smoking crater, its heavy guns twisted into scrap metal. The USS Mason adjusted its heading, staying at the 12-mile limit, its radar still scanning the skies for any sign of a response from the mainland. The extraction was no longer a hope, it was a tactical certainty. 6:15 in the morning, the northern lagoon of Mischief Reef. Two Mark V Special Operations craft emerged from the morning mist like gray predators, their triple turbocharged diesel engines screaming at full throttle as they jumped the 2-meter swells of the inner basin. The extraction was no longer a silent affair. The boats were running hot and loud, their aluminum hulls slamming into the water, with a rhythmic, bone-jarring force that sent sheets of white spray flying over the gunnels. The air was a thick, choking mix of salt, diesel exhaust, and the lingering acrid stench of the naval gunfire that had leveled the northern battery just minutes prior. The seals of red and blue elements did not wait for the boats to beach. As the lead craft, designated Shadow 1, spun its jet drives to bleed off speed in the shallow water, the 8 men waded into the waist-deep surf. They moved with a desperate, heavy urgency, their waterlogged gear weighing nearly 100 pounds. Red 1 grabbed the boarding ladder of the first craft, hauling himself over the side as the boat's rear gunner opened fire with a GAU-17 7.62mm minigun. The weapon's high-pitched electric growl ripped through the morning air, a literal wall of lead, 60 rounds per second, tearing into the remaining sandbagged positions on the shore. The tracers were visible even in the strengthening daylight, a solid line of red light that chewed through concrete and sand, suppressing the few Chinese soldiers who dared to peek over the berms. The smell of hot brass, burnt oil was overwhelming, mixing with the sharp, chemical bite of the cooling water being sucked through the boat's jet intakes. As the last SEAL from Blue Team scrambled aboard Shadow 2, a lone Chinese Type 022 missile boat surged from a hidden concrete pen on the far side of the lagoon. The catamaran-hulled vessel was accelerating fast, its stealthy, faceted surfaces reflecting the orange glow of the rising sun. It was less than 2 kilometers away, and its forward 30mm Gatling gun was already swiveling toward the extraction craft. The water around the Mark V boats began to erupt in jagged white geysers as the Chinese cannon rounds impacted the lagoon. Shadow 1, break north-northwest. Red 1 shouted over the roar of the engines and the scream of the minigun. Engage the pursuit craft. Get us to the blue water. The two special operations craft leaned hard into a synchronized turn, their jet drives throwing massive rooster tails of white water into the air. The side-mounted MK 47-40mm grenade launchers on both boats opened fire, sending a rhythmic thump-thump-thump across the water. The high-explosive dual-purpose grenades arched over the lagoon, splashing around the bow of the Chinese missile boat. One round struck the forward deck, a bright flash of orange and gray smoke, momentarily obscuring the enemy's bridge. The extraction craft hit 70 kilometers per hour as they cleared the western gap of the reef, hitting the larger rollers of the open sea. The transition was violent. The boats leaped clear of the water, their hulls crashing down into the troughs with a sound like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. Every man on board gripped the shock-mitigating seats, their teeth gritted against the impact. Behind them, the missile boat slowed, unwilling to follow the smaller, more agile American craft into the heavy chop of the deep ocean where the USS Mason was waiting. 10 miles out, the silhouette of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer loomed large on the horizon. The ship was a gray fortress against pale blue of the morning sky, its radar dishes still rotating in a restless search for air threats. The SEALs, now out of immediate danger, began to strip off their heavy vests and helmets. Their faces were caked with salt, soot, and the pale dust of the reef, their eyes bloodshot from the lack of sleep and the intensity of the fight. Red 1 to Mason. "We are clear of the lagoon," the team leader said into his encrypted radio, his voice raspy and exhausted. "Objective Coral Shadow is complete. All personnel accounted for." We have 3 walking wounded. No criticals. Requesting immediate recovery. Copy. Red 1. Welcome back. The Mason's air boss replied. We have the flight deck ready and a medical team standing by. We're tracking multiple air signatures from the mainland, so we're going to make this quick. Secure for coming. Alongside. The Mark V boats slowed as they entered the lee of the massive destroyer. The wind here was blocked by the ship's hull, leaving the water unnaturally calm. The SEALs looked back toward the east, where a massive, black pillar of smoke marked the location of Mischief Reef. The fires were still burning, a visible scar on the horizon that signaled the end of the Chinese military's unchallenged dominance in the sector. The sun was fully up now, its light cold and clear, reflecting off the steel of the USS Mason as the crane began to lower the recovery strops. 6:45 in the morning. The aft flight deck of the destroyer USS Mason, moving at 35 knots through the rolling swells of the South China Sea. The recovery of the 2 Mark V special operations craft was a masterpiece of naval coordination. As the destroyer turned into the wind, creating a calm lee on its starboard side, the massive hydraulic crane swung outward. The 8 men of SEAL Team 6, now stripped of their heavy body armor and helmets, stood on the swaying decks of the smaller boats, now stripped of their heavy body armor and helmets, stood on the swaying decks of the smaller boats, their faces a mask of salt crust and dried camouflage paint. They were hauled upward one by one, their boots hitting the non-skid surface of the flight deck with a heavy, hollow thud. To the sterile, organized environment of the destroyer was jarring. The air here was filled with the smell of fresh coffee from the galley and the faint, antiseptic scent of the ship's medical bay. Red 1 was the last to step onto the deck. He moved with a stiff, mechanical gait, the adrenaline of the last 4 hours finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He was met by the ship's executive officer and a pair of intelligence specialists carrying encrypted tablets. There was no celebration, only the quiet, professional urgency of a unit that knew the mission wasn't over until the data was processed. The walking wounded 3 SEALs with minor shrapnel peppering and 1 with a suspected fractured rib were ushered toward the primary battle dressing station by the ship's corpsman. In the ship's Combat Information Center, the first battle damage assessment was already being compiled from satellite overheads and the USS Mason's own high-definition optics. The results of Operation Coral Shadow were devastating. At coordinates 9 degrees 54 minutes north, 115 degrees 32 minutes east, Mischief Reef had been transformed into a blackened graveyard of high-tech hardware. The primary radar hub, which had once provided a 300-mile view of the surrounding airspace, was now a tangled mass of scorched steel at the bottom of the lagoon. The eyes of the southern sector were officially closed. 12 J-11 fighter jets had been reduced to molten slag inside their reinforced hangars. 2 Yacht transport aircraft were gutted remains on the tarmac. The Type 056, a corvette, the primary naval guardian of the reef, had settled into the silt of the harbor, its bridge and superstructure consumed by the fire from its own secondary ammunition cook-off. The pier itself was structurally unsound, severed in 3 places by the precision demolition of Blue Team. The Chinese garrison had suffered heavy losses, with an estimated 42 personnel neutralized and over 60 wounded in the initial breach and subsequent naval gunfire suppression. For the United States, the cost of the operation was remarkably low, a testament to the meticulous planning and the speed of the execution. Aside from the 4 non-critical injuries among the SEAL team, the USS Mason had expended 15 rounds of 5-inch ammunition and 2 SM-2 interceptors to ward off a pair of distant radar locks from the mainland. The USS North Carolina, the silent mothership of the operation, was already deep in the abyss, moving toward its next patrol sector without having fired a single shot. The strategic impact of the raid was immediate. By blinding the radar hub and destroying the interceptor fleet, the United States Navy had created a 400-mile gap in the adversary's anti-access area denial bubble. For at least the next 90 days, Mischief Reef would be unable to support flight operations or coordinate the defense of the surrounding maritime territory. The Great Wall of Sand had been breached, not by a massive fleet, but by 8 men in the dark and a single destroyer at the 12-mile limit. As the sun climbed higher, turning the sea into a sheet of brilliant, hammered silver, the USS Mason began its high-speed transit toward the Philippine Sea. On the horizon to the east, the smoke from the reef was still visible, a thin, black smudge against the clear blue sky. The SEALs were already asleep in the transient bunks below deck, their gear cleaned and stowed for the next deployment. They did not need a debrief to know they had succeeded. The silence of the radio channels from the reef was the only confirmation they required. The operation was a clinical example of modern special warfare, a short, violent application of force that achieved a strategic objective out of all proportion to the number of personnel involved. The professionalism of the United States Navy and its Special Operations Command had been tested against a peer-level fortress, and the fortress had failed. The mission was complete. The sensor net was broken. The South China Sea was, for the moment, a little more open than it had been at midnight.